economical with our bandwidth usage, and that will also smoothen our conversation. The second thing is for you to mute your microphones. And the last thing is for you to, when you have a question, to write it in a chat box, and I'll read them to the speaker, or I'll be able to respond to you via the chat box, so that we can also be economical with the time slot that we've been given to have this conversation. So right now, without further ado, I'm going to invite our Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria, Prof. Jerry Pillay, to give us a word of welcome. So Prof. Pillay, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Luke, and a very warm welcome to all of you, and especially to those who are outside of the UP community, those who are abroad. We are very grateful and thankful that you are joining with us today. I know some of you have been with us all the way through. This is our third webinar, and some of you have been with us now for the third time. And I just want to thank you for the commitment and for the ability just to make yourself available to be with us and to join with us in this special conversations. As you know, we've had two conversations already on race and gender, and our second conversation was on economy and ecology. And today we bring our series to an end as we reflect, for now, as we reflect on doing theology, asking some questions on how, what, and with whom. Now, when we think about the traditional understanding of theology, we generally think about theology as mystical knowledge of God. We think of theology as rational knowledge about articles of faith. We may think of theology as knowledge of God in revelation via Scripture, as God is revealed to us through Scripture. Or we may think about theology as the knowledge of God by human experience. Now, Morris once said that theology is a reasoned discourse about God. Many of you know that Karl Barth, drawing from Anselm, defines theology as faith in search of understanding. Now, I particularly like what Moltmann has to say in recent times. And he says there are three significant points in terms of the transition of theology. And he talks about the transformation of theology in these three different areas. One, he talks about the transition of theology from the age of denominationalism to the ecumenical age, transition from the Eurocentric age to the age of humanity as a whole, and also the transition from mechanistic domination to the age of ecological worldwide community. And he summed it up by saying, theology must be contemporary theology. Meaning that it must share in the sufferings of this present time with the whole creation. And my personal preference is for what liberation theologians and Black theology has taught us about theology. And theology in that sense is understood as praxis. Action theology is a theology of change and transformation. It is contextual and prophetic. Now, they say that COVID-19 has upset politics and economies, providing an opportunity for change, which of course remains to be seen. But it is also true that COVID-19 has disrupted churches and church traditions and practices and even theology. It has, so to speak, flattened the curve of the church hierarchy and denominational boundaries. It has called for church and theology to be more flexible. The church is challenged to be more relational and missional rather than institutional. Theology is about God turning to the world and the world turning to God. How do we do this? How do we keep doing theology? I trust that the conversation that we would have today will help us further as we understand our own context and as we understand the need for contemporary theology as we deal with the real challenges in the world facing us, not just with regards to COVID-19, but also as we continue to struggle for justice in economics, in gender, and in ecological undertakings. So I call you to invite you to this particular webinar and invite you to actually enjoy the conversations that will take place. Again, my special thanks to the presenters for joining with us and for the input that you will give through this webinar itself. May it be a wonderful, inspiring time for us, not only to make us feel comfortable, but more particularly to make us uncomfortable about the realities of the world and the call for what theology should be doing. Thank you so much, and do enjoy this time together. Thanks, Luke.
Luke, your mic is off, eh? Luke, your mic is off.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pile, for your word of welcome. So right now, I will invite Prof. Stefan De Beer to give us an introduction to our webinar series. So, Prof. Stefan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Luke. I was not planning to now do anything more. I will come in later. Maybe just to say, this is the third conversation. As you heard, the first conversation was on COVID-19, race and gender. 2 weeks ago, there was a really good discussion on COVID-19, the economy and the environment. And today is our third conversation. And Luke will introduce our presenter as well. I would just like to invite you to think with us as we go beyond this. I mean, this was meant to be appetizers to get new conversations starting. So it's not the end really of the conversation. It's still the beginning. And so if there are any suggestions, then please speak to Lance, to myself, to our dean. You know, it will be fantastic at some point, as of course, for some of us to be in each other's spaces. If I see people greeting here, people that I've never met before, some of our doctoral students in other parts of Africa. It's wonderful to see all of you. And thank you with us for this third conversation. I will moderate the second part of our conversation after the discussion and after Prof. Pilario. But Luke, back to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. De Beer, for your words. So right now, I'm just going to introduce our guest speaker. So this is Prof. Daniel Pilario from the Philippines. So Prof. Daniel Pilario is a trained sociologist and a liberation theologian. So he currently is the Dean of the St. Vincent School of Theology in Quezon City in the Philippines. So he's a founding member and former president of the Catholic Theological Society of the Philippines. He did his doctoral work at the University of Louvain in Belgium. His dissertation became an award-winning book titled Back to the Rough Grounds of Praxis, and it was published in 2005. His research fuses theology, anthropology, sociology, enculturation, and political theory. Over weekends, he supports parish work in the largest dumping site in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. So during this COVID-19 season, he's been active in mobilizing people and resources to address hunger and bring together theology, activism, and pastoral care in his own life and work. So Prof. Pilario, I'm handing over the screen to you, and we are all looking forward to learning from you and being inspired by your research findings.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you very much, Stefan, and the Institute Faculty of Theology and Religion of the University of Pretoria. Thank you for inviting me, and good noon to all of you. I know this is lunchtime for you. This is also dinner time for us. So it's, anyway, we are all here. Thank you for inviting me. I have a PowerPoint because I only have around 20 or 25 minutes. I have a PowerPoint so that I would not go overboard. Can I present it, Luke, or I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead and present it, Prof.
So is it now? Can you see it now?
Not yet.
It's supposed to be there. It's coming up. Okay.
Yes, yes, I can see it now.
Okay. So we go directly. The topic that was given to me is doing theology now, how, what, and with whom. I do not intend to answer all these questions. Maybe I just would like to present, with the time that is given to me. I just would like to present the terrains, the possibilities, but also the uh, the different ways with which people theologically respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So if previous webinars were about economy and ecology, this is the theological component or the theological view of the whole COVID-19 pandemic. I have 3 points, three main points in the outline. I would like to consider how to think of the COVID-19 pandemic as a locus theologicus. If theology starts with actual situations, with human experience, COVID-19 must be a theologomenon, in one way or the other, place with which to do theology. Second, it might help us in the theological task to see how people respond to the pandemic from the perspective of their faith, either as individuals or as institutions. And thirdly, maybe it is also the task of the theologian to search for spaces of hope for us to move forward in the context of this situation. When people are in despair, it's the task of theology to show where the small the small light would come from in this context. So first, I would like to, my question is, how does the pandemic, what is the lens that the pandemic tells us and provides us with which we read the world? When we read the world, we also read the world theologically, sociologically, also economically, but it would be good to see what the pandemic tells us in terms of lenses. What does it provide? What lens does it provide in reading reality? I have 2 caveats. First of all, this reading comes from my experience in the Philippines, and it might be a different experience in the United States or Italy or South Africa. So bear with my own personal experience. It was also said there that my actual engagement during the time of pandemic is in the largest garbage dump in the Philippines. As I am working there, a lot of problems are going on in that place. So it's also from that reading. And thirdly, this reading also comes from my Roman Catholic background, which might be different with other church affiliations for that matter. So these are the limitations of my reading, but hopefully in the conversation that follow, we can continue with that. I have identified, for lack of time, I have identified 4 lenses with which COVID-19 forces us to read the world. First is sickness and hunger. Second is the metaphor of war and the politics of fear, especially in the context of the Philippines. And thirdly, the international notion from the WHO on social distancing and the use of face masks. And fourthly, the experience of church people in closing their churches and doing online liturgies. Let me do it one by one. Sickness and hunger. The picture you see are people who, because of the lockdown in the Philippines, it is said that we have the harshest lockdown in the world. We are on our 5th month of the lockdown, when people could not work. And in the context of no work, no wage policy, this is really low total hunger. In this, the first reality is sickness, and sickness is real. Philippines belong to the top 10 highest in the world. We have 3,000 to 4,000 cases a day of COVID positive patients. We have already 120, I think today, 121 or 122,000 COVID positive patients. Our hospitals are full, plus you have a corrupt health system, and that brings us to disaster. The second reality is hunger. No? Hunger is real. It's as real as the sickness. It's, as I said, we have the longest and the most harsh lockdown, I think, worldwide. There was one father whom I interviewed in Payatas. Payatas is the garbage dump, which I was referring to. He says, I prefer to die of COVID than to see my children die of hunger. He was actually going out when people are told to stay at home. And these people told to stay at home actually launch a rally. And of course, you get a military response. This brings us now, you have COVID plus hunger plus corruption and incompetence, then it would spell total disaster. Number two, the second reality is the response of the government in the Philippines. Well, of course, we have said that metaphors do not describe reality, they create reality. And if you have a metaphor of war, then you are creating that reality in the midst of your people. During the first week of the lockdown, this is a police uniform, which they donned on. They did not have this before, but on the lockdown itself, with Armalites and this new uniform, you're actually on to a military response or securitization of the pandemic.
Danny, sorry, just the slides we don't see. If you meant to show, yeah, thanks.
You don't see that slide?
We see it now.
Oh, earlier. Okay.
We now do. We now do.
We now do.
Why we couldn't
But
see?
this one you can.
Yeah, that we can, yes.
We can, yes.
This one you can. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Can, yeah.
Okay. Where am I? Okay. You have this police uniform together with Armalites as their response to the pandemic. In the end, they wanted to foment politics of fear, and the peak expression of that is during the pandemic, the Congress in the Philippines approved of the anti-terror law, and anybody who goes against the government could be a terrorist for that matter. Now, people are talking about the new normal. What is the new normal in the pandemic? I think it's not about online classes or social distancing. It is about social discipline, new hegemonies, and further marginalization. Further marginalization of the poor, of the critics of the opposition, and of the media who are critical to the government. So you have a sickness and a military response to the sickness. Thirdly is the notion of social distancing. COVID-19 is actually a culture of suspicion. Everyone is suspect, even your own family members. So you suspect that the other is positive, and he also suspects that you are positive. But because it's social distancing is a metaphor, I think it's not a happy metaphor, because actually what you mean is physical distancing. But when you say social distancing, I'm asking, what is lost here is the sense of community, the sense of empathy, and the sense of solidarity. When someone is in need, when someone is sick, when someone is hungry, you do social distancing. And that's the end of what we have fought for in the churches for a long time. But I have also seen that social distancing has its own social conditions of possibility. Not everybody can do social distancing. The middle classes and the higher classes, well, can survive by just living in their own homes during the pandemic. But the poor, they have small homes, which is impossible to do social distance or physical distance, and they have no food. So in one way or the other, there is a a class component to the metaphor of social distance. We will talk about it later and how religions respond. Fourth are the closed churches and online liturgies. In the pandemic, being church people ourselves, we have experienced that our churches also closed shop together with malls and groceries. No, there's no customer allowed also in the churches. In general, this is the response, but you can also see brave and creative prophets who defied these hegemonic voices. Now, online churches and online liturgies, there is plus or minus. Plus, because we can still reach out to our members, even when we do not have physical proximity and physical presence. But on the other hand, minus, actually, it's only few people whom we can reach out. Those who have internets, but those in far-flung areas, those who have no food even, online ministry is in fact inaccessible. Now, the next question, if those are the lenses with which COVID-19 has forced us to read the world, the next question is, what are the faith responses that the people that we see in people's lives and in churches as institutions? Let me map some of them. I have two maps. First, these are faith responses of individual believers. And individual believers, I think, are focused on the theology question. For instance, one response would be the notion of the theodicy question means, where is God in this pandemic? Why has God, in one way or the other, permitted this to happen? The first response is God is punishing us. It's actually blaming, I have seen some websites, it's actually blaming on the sins of others, no? Like, for instance, because of the LGBT or Pride Parade, etc., etc. I have even seen an ISIS tape which says it's the first world, the Western world, who is causing all of this. It's coming from them. It's not about us. However, that's an external notion of God's punishment. But there are also people, especially those who are suffering from mental health issues during the lockdown, those who are suffering from fear, for instance, is blaming it on themselves. And they ask the usual question, together with self-pity and all mental health problems: why did this happen to me? Why did God punish me this way? But of course, this, like the social distance, it has also its class dimension. What I mean is, people suffer mental health. Not so much in my own experience. I have worked in that garbage dump. People really want to survive first before being plagued by fear. And you can see the strength and you can see the courage with which people tried to respond to the pandemic. The second response is, this is God's act and this is God's will. Not so much as punishment, but so that we can learn. So that we can learn something from ourselves and the world, or so that I can have time for my family. You can hear this on social media. No? Then now I appreciate the farmer who is actually providing me with all this food without... then I can also learn how to cook, do gardening, etc. Makes me more resilient. Nietzsche says, if it does not kill you, it will help you. The next question is, what if it will kill you? What if death comes to your family? What if your closest friend dies because of the virus? Then some theologians talk about the call to lamentation, the call to grieving, brought about by the confrontation with death, with mortality, and vulnerability. Actually, this is the same cry of the prophets. Lord, I have been chased by my enemy, and please help me, etc. Fourth response is the call to creativity. You do not rest on lament. You do not rest on grieving. It calls one to be creative and to be in solidarity with the others. The other response is the faith response of the churches. I call this the institutional questions. I was trying to search, how do the churches, Catholic churches, Protestant churches, evangelical churches, or even other churches like Muslim churches, how do they respond to the pandemic? I distinguish three. One is called, what I call is irrational non-conformity response. This is actually a faith-centered response. You see the picture next to my text. During the height of the pandemic in the Philippines, these people went out into the streets, and this is the child Christ. Traditionally, they implore the Christ to, they dance to him in order for him to help us in our problem today. So during the height of the lockdown, people went out to the streets and celebrate their feast, their fiesta. No, for me, this is defying science and politics in preference to faith. This is also this is also the same thing as a question of the churches, either in the United States or somewhere else. It says, when the malls opened, when business opened, why the churches could not open? Are we not essential too? In this context, you have a hegemonic faith response. First of all, this is an assertion of the autonomy of the religious sphere, but also a non-reflexive response of religion over other fields. So it's plus minus, no? It's dual phase. A religion which has been sidelined asserts itself, but also asserting itself non-reflexively and in a non-listening way to other fields in context. The majority of the response is number two. Most of the churches, in fact, responded with blind conformity. They stopped all services regardless of need and situation. I have seen a diocese, even if someone, for instance, need like the prayer for the dying, in the Catholic tradition, the anointing of the sick, which is the most important rite or ritual in the life of a person. Because of the lockdown, priests do not do that service. And there is even one area where the bishop says relief operation is prohibited. And when your people are hungry, how can you do that? Because of blind conformity response. This, I think, is the majority response. The third is, in fact, what I call creative engagements. Because, in fact, there are also alternative creative voices. I have seen priests wearing PPEs, personal protective equipment, going to places where there are COVID patients or COVID burials and bless them. Relief operations are all over the place, regardless of what of the risk it involves. Now, these two responses for me is, well, if we can theologize from there, we will see what our theology would look like. Let me go back, let me go to the third part, which is the last part of my sharing. The first is, in this context, in the context of death and despair, I think if theology is to be valid, it's to be a search for spaces of hope, identifying where hope comes from in these difficult times. Let me give three reflections on this. I think the churches should serve as spaces of care and not of fear. If the political situation tells us about war and fear, the churches should be prophetic in its movement from politics of fear to a culture of care. If fear is the running thread from extrajudicial killings in the Philippines to anti-terrorism law, the church should say no to it and provide resistance. Resistance for me is twofold. Resistance is creative prophetizing in the ever-narrowing spaces of dissent that I see in the world around me. It is resistance to the normalization process of dictatorship and authoritarian regimes. It's also present in many populist regimes like Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc. However, for me, there is another phase of resistance. Resistance means our church should be spaces of welcome, solidarity, care, and here comes what Pope Francis was saying, the metaphor of the field hospital. The field hospital is not that big hospital. It's very small field hospital where without all the trappings of big laboratories, we still minister to the sick, the lonely, and the hungry. In the end, it should be spaces or sanctuaries or asylums where people can come and be cured and to be ministered themselves. I have one story. I have been helping also people who are street dwellers, some of them living under the bridge. In one of those bridges, you have like 10, 20, 30 families living. And no one in that bridge is related with one another. I have asked, so who is this and who is that? And they do not know them. And said they just welcome them because the police is hounding them. I was thinking, this is the church under the bridge. Precisely when we are threatened, the church should be asylums for people who need our care. This is precisely what I mean by the church as field hospital. I posted this. This is a church actually in Manila. And during the pandemic, since there are no masses and there are no liturgies, he has filled it with squash, with vegetables, with rice. And I asked the parish priest, what's going on there? And he said, well, we could not say mass and liturgies. I think this is the way to open the church. This is the way to open the churches, not for liturgies, but for works of solidarity. And then I begin to remember Matthew 9:13, who says, go and learn what this means. All I desire is mercy and not sacrifice. Second, I think at this time, churches would act as emotional networks of compassion. And I was thinking, this is my Payatas experience. The picture on the side is a list of names of most vulnerable families in the area of a specific leader where he can or she can distribute rice, milk, and whatever can be distributed. There are around 40 mothers who are doing this with such a list you can see. Since the lockdown for 4 or 5 months now, every week we meet so that the mothers, leaders of churches, small churches, can coordinate on what to do with the relief operation in that parish. For me, this is a critique to the incompetence and corruption of the government, who does not know where to distribute whatever they have, if they can distribute. And second is a critique to what I call the technocratic advocacy of the NGOs and civil society, who do not anymore capture the real feelings of the people on the ground. The churches, in fact, provides a critique to bureaucratic arrangements, social arrangements around. And this is done by the BEC, Basic Ecclesial Community Mothers, who has local knowledge, who has emotional interpersonal network. And these mothers conquered their fear for love of their neighbor. In one of those Sundays, I asked them, these are the mothers who are repacking rice for their neighbors. And in our reflection, I asked them, This is already 2 months in the pandemic. You are still here. I would like to ask a question. Why are you here? What made you stay? What made you risk your lives? Because you are also risking your lives. You have your own families, and they do not get anything for this. They just get the same 5 kilos or 3 kilos of rice like the rest of the families they distribute to. And I was really touched by the response of one mother, and she said, I could not survive with my neighbor feeling hungry. And this is what the gospel told me. I should be there to bring him food. That strikes me as meaningful because you see, it's the churches and our theologies and our resources, theological resources, that help people survive in the context of the pandemic. Third, and my last point, church online, between the virtual and the real. In the Catholic tradition, people are asking, these are some small and crazy questions. And how valid are the sacraments online? Is it real time or replay? When you hear Mass, is it valid when you are real time or it's a replay? Is direct confession to God, which is a Protestant tradition, now it has to be rethought, no? Etc. You have, there's one person who told me, Father, can you give me absolution through Zoom? So I don't like to answer all these liturgical questions. Let the liturgists do it. But for me, these online issues, liturgical issues, is in fact a concern of the few. Because many, maybe 70%, do not have access to internet. So whom are you talking about? But the online churches also, the COVID-19 also forces us to rethink, as theologians, our theological categories. Now, people are crazy about online liturgies. But I think there is a need to rethink the virtual. For instance, whether the physical, the concrete, and the bodily, is this not what incarnation is all about? So, I think the virtual is useful, but it is not all. Second, maybe also for the Catholic tradition, the rethinking of the theology of forgiveness, which has been before, for a long time, very much priest-centered. That the priest and his instrumentation is able to forgive sins. And that's precisely in the third, the rethinking of clericalism. When pastors and clerics are no longer there because they could not go out, people survive in their faith. And then it would be good for the church to rethink, are the clerics, are the pastors really central to the churches? In the end, let me give 5 points. For me, these are challenging directions posed by COVID-19 to theology and ministry. Number 1, to rethink the priest-centered church and recover again the role of the laity in the faith community. There's a need to rethink from grand churches framework to the idea of small communities. Number 2, to go beyond meticulous questions on the virtual and find the presence of God in the real. In the Catholic tradition, you have what you call corporal works of mercy. I think in this context, there is a need to recover and revisit such a traditional concept. Number 3, to go beyond formalistic and rubric-dictated liturgies towards creative worship beyond church walls and traditional church rituals. Number 4, to combat fear and indifference towards organizing, to combat fear and indifference, which is fostered by the political sphere, and to organize one's parish or one's community with new and creative ministries for the vulnerable and the sick. Last, beyond being cultic leaders and liturgy presiders, I think priests and pastors need to be physically close as possible. And this is difficult because of social distancing, but we need to be physically close as possible to our flock who suffer from all kinds of fear, of pain, and hunger. I think let me end here so that we can proceed to the rest. I'm sorry I overshoot my time a little bit. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you very much, Prof. Pilario, for this very insightful presentation. I've personally learned a lot. So, dear friends and colleagues that have listened to Prof. Pilario, I would like to just open the floor for any questions. And remember, please ask your question in the chat box, and I'll read it and ask it to Professor Pilario. Any questions? Thank you. I see many words of affirmation. I think I concur and relate to many of these words because I've personally learned a lot from this presentation as someone who has a lifelong commitment to incarnational ministry in a community of poverty. COVID-19 has definitely been an accentuation of the survival mode that many of our neighbors go through, thinking about the health stress and now surviving hunger that came with lockdown. So I see one question from Mattis Slatter, and it says, do you think that the virtual services would remain once the lockdown situation changes?
Okay. I think the virtual services and virtual liturgies have already been there even before COVID-19. That is why when COVID-19 came,
okay, great.
Hello, can you hear me? Luke, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Prof. Pilario.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, I think it has been there since before COVID-19. But when COVID-19 came, some churches are more ready than others. But now, because of the situation, I think churches are into it now. Well, are they going to continue even after the lockdown? I think they will, because we are into a wired world. But the point in my talk is it does not suffice, because if we go into the incarnational dimension of the faith, you really need someone for you to be hugged, for you to be assured that it would be okay, and that incarnational dimension is necessary. Is a necessary faith dimension.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just read through a few questions, and hopefully Prof. Pilario will be able to consolidate many of them and just give us respond to them or give a feedback. The first one is, does this mean that theology that is needed today needs to be mostly focused on the poor and suffering? And another one is that, how does what you shared challenge our theological education, curricula, and pedagogies? And another one is, how can we help congregants deal with fear practically? Let me stop there for now, and then if you could answer those questions, and I will proceed to further questions that have been asked.
Okay. If the new normal is about poverty, if the new normal is about marginalization, if the new normal is about instilling fear in people, which is the context in the Philippines, I think churches should be taking care of the poor and the suffering in the new normal. Well, it depends on how you read the new normal. People are saying new normal is about virtual reality. If that is your reading, then the church's response should be about virtual reality. But if you read the new normal about normalization as about people getting more poor than before, then the churches should respond in that context. Now, what does this mean for theological education? Theological education should be a theology, what I call in our school of theology, we have a tagline, doing theology from the margins. If our students should be sensitized from the beginning, the theology is about the margins, is about learning from the margins. It's about taking care of the margins, which actually was the work of Jesus. And then we already are getting our students ready towards that ministry in the margins. Now how do we help people deal with fear? Precisely, this is the new normal too. When people are instilled fear, they live in fear. And this is a little bit ironic. Actually, it's the middle classes who are more fearful, because the really poor has no time to fear, because they have all the need to look for food. And that's the first act before getting fearful. So they go out of the streets. So it's a little bit ambivalent. How to deal with fear, that's also necessary. Online counseling, whatever it is. But also you can see that the poor becomes our model to responding against the politics of fear instilled in us by political arrangements or by laws from dictatorial governments. I don't know if I answer, but more or less, I think my ideas are around that line.
Lucas, your mic is off, Luke.
Let me just go through a last round of questions, and then because we are now restrained by time, I'm just going to read through a few of them, and then Prof. Pilario will answer as you've done. And thank you for the answers that you already gave. So how can we reach children and youth in poorer communities, bearing in mind physical or social distancing? Another one is, well, I've been drawn to think of resistance in the face of dictatorial regimes and strict government guidelines. So, and rethink the priest-centered church, how to deconstruct the institutional hierarchy of the mainline churches. And similar to that, someone has to kind of expand on the whole concept of rethinking clerical-centered churches beyond COVID-19.
Okay. The question on the how do you do physical distancing and taking care of those who are poor and hungry, doing relief operation? In the beginning of the lockdown, we really thought that it was difficult to do this. I was even thinking, when the government was saying stay at home, we should obey, because we do not know what is the behavior of this virus. But when I was confronted with hunger, how can you stay at home? People who can stay at home are those who have food inside the home. But there are many who do not have food. So we were in fact risking ourselves. But the risk was necessary. My idea during that time is this: if the doctors take care of the sick in the hospital because it's their calling to take care of the sick, the priests, the leaders of the community, should be with the poor because it is their calling to be with the poor. And that risk was necessary. Were there people who were infected? At the moment, there is one, but she is safe. We also do, take care of ourselves. All this mask and everything like that, shield. But there is no way of stopping us, like what that mother said. There's no way of stopping us, because I could not survive when my neighbor is dying. So I think that courage given to us by the Christian tradition is very helpful in that work. That's precisely brings us to the notion of resistance. Resistance. In the Philippines, we are trying to do prophetic resistance against the government, which is getting very, very dictatorial every day. But resistance also means to be able to help my neighbor who could not survive. This is resistance as well. That the church, that the people would feel that the church is close by when they needed it. And in this context, it's the third question, deconstructing clericalism in mainline churches. I think now COVID-19 forces us to rethink that people actually survive without pastors and without priests by their side. This is what they have been doing for a long time. In the context of Catholicism in the Philippines, you have a lot of people who could not be reached by the priest even before the COVID pandemic, and the faith has survived. Now, the faith survives even without the priest, even without the pastor. Why could we go back to that old normal when in fact we can reshape the church again and bring in the context of leadership of the laity, small Christian communities where compassion and care is very much present. This is, for me, a challenge to rethink grand churches and grand pastoral schemes, which, in fact, well, I have read a book a long time ago by Schumacher, which says, small is beautiful. I think today, the churches should proclaim that. Small is beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much again, Prof. Pilario, for this very insightful presentation you made for us. So right now, I'm just going to thank you, friends, for the good questions you asked. And now I'm going to just hand over to Prof. Stephen De Beer to take over from me for the rest of our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you so much, Danny. I'm sure most of us would agree, let me speak for myself. I would have been able to listen for much longer. And I hope a time will come soon where perhaps we can be face to face. Definitely from our center side, we would like to stay in touch with you and the work that you do at St. Vincent's, and I'm sure the Dean would probably resonate that as well. We're going to carry on, so I hope, Danny, you can stay with us for a bit. There will be two responses, brief responses from two friends. Selina Headley. Selina is the formational coordinator of the Institute for Urban Ministry. She's also a PhD candidate here in our faculty and actually working on questions of theological curriculum and reimagining it, as well as Tsakani Sabanda. Tsakani is doing really exciting work in Khayelitsha with the Church of the Nazarene, kind of bringing pastoral care and activism together, rethinking the church in that very tough context. And both of them are just going to kind of respond, I guess, from where you sit to what Danny was sharing with us this afternoon. So over to you. And then after them, I will introduce Dion. He will kind of just tell us what he's heard over the three conversations, and then we'll have another round for a few questions or comments. So welcome, Selina and Tsakani. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The internet failed me right around the time when you were presenting the the alternative, so I don't have the full picture, but I'll try to respond. And I feel like it really is a call for us to consider how do we reshape our theological education and formation if we are looking at the realities. So with what has been our response theologically, have we prepared people well to be able to engage, and really what's our position as the Academy in reference to the communities as part of our challenge? Do we have contradictory goals in the Academy to the lived reality of people on the ground is part of the challenge? And what are the hierarchical relationships that we uphold in the Academy that don't allow us to actually reflect well and deeply on the lived realities of people? What kind of connection do we have? So if we're looking at the face of sickness and hunger, if we're looking at the sort of the metaphor of war, whether it's war against the pandemic, this kind of thinking is out there. How do we prepare people with a sense of community and empathy and solidarity? I wonder if our kind of theological, academic tendencies, we sort of amplify the social distance of God more than we amplify the closeness of God. So how do we do theology in ways that connect? Part of our challenges perhaps is, are we listening? Are we close to the ground, to where people are? I think the deep challenge of this question of proximity. So where do we conduct our theological education? Are we in places where people are? We'd have to rethink how we teach, where we teach, and to equip people so that we are doing the kind of research, the kind of theologizing that is close to the people, to the culture, because really we're in a chance to reshape everything. And the kind of work of the Academy should be that of helping us think about answering the hunger and the death of our planet and all the kinds of things that are taking place. So really, if we're not theologizing at the grassroots, if we're not close to the people, if we're not having the kind of formation for our spaces, that we are having a prophetic response and teaching people to theologize in that way. So if many of our students are faced with these realities and where people are going to learn and to practice their faith and help faith communities, we really have to reshape the way we are training people, the way we are shaping them, and perhaps to disrupt the way research is done, disrupt the way the Academy approaches things, because we can't continue. This is a chance to remake and reshape the work, so that the work of helping people to do theology at the margins is really, really important. So I just appreciated so much of what was shared, and not doing really justice to it, but part of it is this question of proximity of theology, proximity of where do we theologize, and if universities have had the same response, essentially closing down, how do we begin to open up space again to come close to where the need is and to where people are? And if our theology and our education isn't helping us to train people to do that, then maybe we have to think about reshaping and re-looking at it. So I think I'm going to let Jeanette talk a little bit more about very practical approaches and why the kind of theology that is practiced on the ground. Jeanette, go ahead. I think your mic is off, Jeanette.
Yes, I was trying to unmute myself there and it didn't seem to be working. But thank you for this opportunity to be here and to have to share with you. And thank you so much. That was a really powerful presentation. I think for me, I was listening to that metaphors creates reality, and just thinking about where we are located. Now, a few weeks ago, I think many of us might have seen, there was a video that went viral online of a man being evicted, and he was naked with a lot of around him. So many men evicting one man from a shack, and he was naked. They found, and that video just so repulsive. This is the community that I'm part of in a way, in Kailicha, where evictions have been so real and so tangible. During lockdown, there was a policy that evictions were illegal, so people should not be evicted. And yet the people who were doing the evictions were the military themselves, the police. The city of Cape Town was evicting people. So a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, I think we had a few pastors. We went to that community at 10 minutes, so that one of the communities that is struggling with evictions and between the city and being sitting there. We got to visit them, and in that visitation, we were asking the question of, what is it that the church should be doing during this time when people are struggling, and asking the questions why there's so many people who are located in places where they have to be, evicted. And so one of the things was, most of the people have lost jobs. They can't afford rent, so they have to find new places of living. And this is the only place where they can go. And one of the places, it's named Etembeni, a place of hope. And yet this is the very same place where we're seeing the violation, the evictions, the pushbacks, the grenades. And one of the activists had one of those grenades blow in his head. And, he was hospitalized, and he couldn't even be present at the meeting. And just to see the violence and the pain, and to see people being tormented so much just because they can't afford, they don't have jobs anymore, they can't work anymore. And yesterday, when we were at the church, there was a lady who came in and said, she wanted to talk to me, but we have a training that's going on, which I will talk about just now. So she comes in to want to talk to me, and I'm having this meeting with one of the Doctors Without Borders and the City of Cape Town people. And she's looking at me, and I can see she's hungry, and she's coming to me because she's like, what's going on here? We're hungry, what's happening? And I'm like divided between, do I continue to have a conversation with these most important people who are here, or do I attend to the lady who is looking at me? And I know exactly what is it that she's asking for. And I think that's constantly where the church is caught up. And I think I really appreciate, Professor Pilaro's, presentation, because we find ourselves constantly as ministers or as people, especially right now, where the powers at be have been exposed, and also the poverty and the conditions of our people have been even, exposed even more. And to say, so where does the church, fit in? And to say, I said to another friend of mine, I find myself really torn in between, because on one hand, you side with the power when you have to, have these conversations on liaising with how do we leverage that power into the community. And on the one hand, you have to turn against them because you're asking for permissions to do things. And on the one hand, you have to be activists and say, no, we have to take this land because people have nowhere to go. And the very same power you're trying to negotiate with, they come with force towards you. And I think the question then for me would be, looking at this presentation, would be then, what is the theology that informs our action at this particular moment? So what are we looking at? What is the theology from the ground? And how does that then inform the academy? But for me, importantly, is how are we ready to respond? How are we actually acting into the space where we are finding ourselves? Much of the response has been from government side or from top down, the hierarchies coming into the communities. And I find the church is well located to be the instrument where actually responses are coming from the grounds up and not from the top down, because I think those are most effective ways of actually engaging with some of the COVID challenges. So if we're talking about virtual church, for example, most of our people, data is very expensive. Now we are unemployed. Now we have no jobs. So how do we then how do we engage? How do we continually have church? So in our meeting with Etembeni, which is very ironic because it's a place of hope, and yes, it's a place where violence and conflict happens between the city and the residents. When we get there, when we were having a meeting with them, they broke out in songs of worship and praise in the middle of all of that. And then the whole community gathered. And they were saying, we need to see the church. We are very excited to see the church journeying with us in a place like this, which is not something that I was actually not even expecting, because we wanted to go listen and see how we as a church can journey with a community that is now, in conflict with the city, in a way. So, but to see them breaking out in song, to see them worshiping, to see them, praising and saying, we are grateful that in this particular community, in this time, no one has died yet of COVID. And yet it's a big, it's one of the threats that's coming in. And because there's not even the possibility of physical distancing or spaces where the shacks don't have windows to be able to have ventilation. And they were just even grateful for that particular point. So for me to see the places of hope, to that community, to hear that it is a place of hope in a time like this was, where do we find God? Where do we see God? So when we say we're doing theology, where is God? And for me, God is located in that particular community where there is so much violence and so much conflict between the city, and having to see people being evicted and wrestling so much. And so how we then prepare ministers, or even getting, the laity involved on how do we understand God in this time like this? And the theology, for me, I'm saying theology must come from the ground up, and not necessarily a theology that comes from the top down, because that theology may not necessarily understand the condition of a man who's being evicted naked. And when you have to be there as a pastor, then what do I say? I'm like, I'm out of words. Who do I say? Other people will say it's illegal. These people should not be here. Therefore, we side with the city for not being here, because there's not even a possibility to shield them from COVID-19. So those conditions, I think for me, when we're talking about even COVID-19 now, people are saying we're not afraid of death, because death is something we face every single day. So when we are afraid of COVID-19, people are like, but things are not changing. Things have always been the same way that they are. So even at the higher risk. So I think being located in a place like this where theology has, I think my thing is theology has to be something that we are engaging with our congregation, because those same people that we're visiting, the same people who are being, rubber bullets every day, people who are being evicted, who have nowhere to go, losing every property they have. I think that's a condition that we find ourselves in. And the last thing that I wanted to say was, what I find even more powerful, I think when we start to having the church as a place where responses can happen from the grounds up and not from the top down. The conversations we're just having in the last few days with some of our community members, realizing the much knowledge, the abilities, the capabilities of our people to be able to understand their faith, to reason, but also to be able to say, these are the solutions. We are coming up with locally based solutions on how we can shield ourselves, protect ourselves from COVID-19, which I find those solutions are a little bit more different from what the city or maybe the government has been seeing as a way of protecting the communities. So we are not tapping into those, and I think maybe tapping into the lived realities of people can be really helpful. So I think that's the few things that I wanted to share with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, Selina, Jeanette, and I also see people continue to contribute in the chat room, so the conversation continues. That's the interesting thing, of course, of the virtual. You can have all these conversations at the same time, and you're not even seen as rude. So thank you for that. We have 22 minutes left. So Dion Foster, I'm going to ask Dion to. He has the difficult task. We asked Dion, he's with the Department of Systematic Theology and Ethics at Stellenbosch University, directing the Beyers-Naudé Center for Public Theology. And Dion was gracious enough to listen in for all three conversations. And we specifically asked him to listen with us, COVID-19, race and gender, economy and the environment, doing theology now, today. Maybe, Dion, over to you. If you want to share some of what you heard, and we also hope to, partly why we also like Dion to be in the space is we try to be a bit more deliberate about our own relationship between ourselves and the center in Stellenbosch. So thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Stefan, thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you, and particularly today, Daniel, Selina, and Sakani, just wonderful to be able to join you. Yeah, it's been a wonderful series of weeks, and I must say I'm so grateful for you convening and holding this space for us. And so, Stefan, to you and to Lance, to your Dean, Professor Pillay, to the colleagues who've facilitated this space. It's really been such a meaningful set of engagements. And it seems like almost a lifetime ago when we had the Reverend Marcin Kla and Professor Charlene van der Walt kicking us off on race and gender. And then, of course, the second one, as we remember, was on economy and ecology. And then, of course, doing theology today. I was lying awake last night thinking, you know, how does one bring this together? And was reminded of a quote from Miguel de la Torre's book, Doing Ethics from the Margins. And Daniel, it was so lovely to hear you referring to that particular statement today. But in his book, Doing Ethics from the Margins, Miguel de la Torre says, our education systems are never neutral or objective. And he goes on to say that the classroom is appropriately named because it is indeed a room of class. Think about that for a moment. The classroom is a room of class. It's a room where students learn what class they belong to or don't belong to. And it also commutes certain powers and privileges that come with education and the learning class. And I was struck by that throughout all of the presentations that we had, that for many of the presenters, there were some subtle, hopeful, resisting ways of pushing back at some of the structures that seek to divide, that seek to hold certain persons out, and create spaces for others to hold on to positions of privilege and opportunity. And the recognition that we have a responsibility in our theological education. I was particularly reminded, Stefan, as I listened to the comments and to the presentations in the first week, that the work of theology across the globe, but particularly so in South Africa, is deeply intersectional. And Charlene reminded us of that we cannot talk about what it means to be faithful to the kingdom of God and the call of the gospel without thinking about issues such as race and gender and class. These have to come into our conversations in a very central way. And Moss reminded us that many of the challenges and problems that we are experiencing as daily realities, such as hunger, the geographic and economic inequalities that we are seeing in our land, extreme poverty, the inequities in a healthcare system are not caused by COVID-19, but the pandemic somehow has lifted the very thin veneer that we hold over our society, that we tend to paint over so that there can be a normal life for those of us who have privilege. And Daniel, you reminded us of that again today. Many of us who are participating on these webinars do come from a space of privilege. But Stefan, I was also reminded by something that Achille Mbembe said in that wonderful book of his on the post-colony, where he said, even the dominated need to be recognized as having a rich and complex consciousness, and they are capable of challenging their oppression and the power, and that power is far from being total. It can be endlessly contested, deflated, and reappropriated from the targets. And, as we were listening to many of the presentations over the last 3 weeks, it struck me again that theology is not something which is done only in the academy. I'm reminded of the work, Daniel, of a wonderful Catholic theologian named David Tracy, who makes the point that all theology has a responsibility to operate in public, because beliefs don't end at our front door. If we have certain beliefs about race or how the economy should be structured, or about gender, they run into our world, into our societies. And so Damaris reminded us last week when she spoke about Africa's urban futures, green, safe, and just, that Christianity in particular across the world has played a somewhat ambiguous role. At times, it's offered hope, it's offered resilience, it's given persons the sense of being able to cope with difficult structures. But at times, our beliefs have also been the source of making persons unsafe, of robbing the environment of the justice that it should have, and of causing us to live in ways that are counter to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And of course, in today's sessions, we heard from Daniel, from Selina, and from Jeanette, from Tsakani, the different ways in which that can also take place. Now, I just want to mention in closing three things, if I may, Stefan, which have struck me. The first is that South Africa remains a deeply religious society. Just two statistics, if I may. The 2013 household survey showed that 84.2% of South Africans indicated that they are religious. So that's an increase of 5% in religiosity from the 2001 household statistics. The second thing that's very important in this regard is that the 2010 Pew report found that 74% of South Africans indicated that religion plays a significant role in their lives. And in fact, the World Values Survey shows that South Africa is one of only 2 countries in the world where religious leaders and religious institutions hold higher levels of trust than either the levels of trust that are put in the state or in other public actors. So this is a tremendous responsibility that we bear. And we know that theology is done not only in the academy, but it's also done in our pulpits, it's done in our pews, and also in our homes. And so the role that we play as theological researchers, as educators, as members of churches and congregations, indeed as members of a society that is deeply religious, is an important role for us to hold in mind. So Miguel de la Torre says again, I just want to return to this as we come to the conclusion. He says the task of educators, specifically those who think of themselves as theologians, is to cultivate an ability for persons to find their own voices by creating an environment in which individual and collective consciousness raising can occur. Now, I think this is one of the important things that we've seen in these 3 webinars. What's been a tremendous gift for me is the way in which we've been able to bring forth the richness of our own context and own traditions, particularly an African Christian theology, in conversation with perspectives from elsewhere. Vuyani Velum, one of the late colleagues of your university, said one of the deadliest strategies that is assumed by the 21st century empire is to subvert our Africanness, since it applies an assimilation of the African identity, and this can lead to a death of consciousness. So the first thing that I want to say is how and where and with whom should we do our theology? I believe that we should be doing authentically African Christian theology. On this continent, as we hear from BT, Africans are not religiously illiterate. In fact, we have a great deal to offer, and the difference of our experience can be related to the rest of the world. So this is what I want to end with as I close up my reflection on these wonderful sessions. Stefan, I think this has been such a fruitful engagement, and I really want to say thank you to the University of Pretoria, to your center, and to yourself for hosting us in this way. Jokingly last night, you wrote me an email and said, as a Methodist, I'm allowed to give a charge. Now, a charge is something which is quite unique to the Methodist tradition. It's a sermon which is preached. And I remember when I was a young minister, in Gauteng, serving in a township congregation, my former bishop, Peter Story, charged us with 4 tasks. And I think this is something that we can still hold on to as we think about the future of theological education. Peter Story said we have 4 tasks to do. The first thing that he said is we have a task to proclaim the truth. And I think this is particularly important in the society and culture in which we live. Proclaim the truth without fear and expose lies wherever you encounter them, whether it's in yourself, in the media, or even in the churches and denominations within which you live and serve. Secondly, he said we should bind up the broken. Wherever we have the opportunity to do so, we should always place ourselves on the side of the victims of injustice, wherever we may find them. And this is an important task for us as theologians and as educators. Thirdly, he said, not only proclaim the truth, secondly, not only bind up the broken, but thirdly, live the alternative. We should seek to be a visible contradiction to any system or belief or structure that denies God's goodness and blessedness in people and in creation. And finally, he said, wherever you are able, replace evil with good. So Stefan, thank you for leading us in these sessions. It's been a joy, and we look forward to future conversations in this regard.
Thank you so much, Dion, for those words and for stringing the 3 conversations together like that for us. We have 8 minutes left. I want us to use that, so please stay with us for a bit. If you were not able, thank you, Dion, thank you, Selina Tsakani. If you were not able to be with us for the 3, or if you were, but you would like to go back and listen, or you maybe were kicked off the web, these are recorded, so you can just check in with Lance. I'm going to take 3 or 4 comments. Maybe if there are any comments still outstanding, please do so. And then I want to ask, maybe if you want to say a last word, Danny, and Jerry, if you're still with us, if you maybe want to just wrap up right at the end. But is there any last comment or question from people to any of the participants? It seems there's so much that people want to reflect on. So I think we should perhaps then, if there are not other comments or questions, it will be available. Please go and listen again. Danny, maybe from what you read, from what you heard now, is there any last word that you would like to share with us, perhaps? Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I was listening to the reactions and to the reactors and Dion's last words. What comes to my mind is, in fact, the need for reflexive theologizing. Reflexivity is a sociological term made popular by Bourdieu and the other sociologists, which needs to be applied to theological reflection. Questions of Selena and Jeanette, of questions like, where are we theologizing? What is the academe? Where is the location of the academe in the context of these theologies and these locations from the grounds? Need reflexivity. And for me, theology needs to be reflexive vis-a-vis other sciences. To be able to assert a hegemonic voice over, for instance, medical sciences today is irresponsible for theology. I think that's necessary. But beyond that, theology should be reflexive vis-a-vis the grounds where people live. And this is where academy has to put itself into question. Because I think the location of the academe itself, which Bourdieu says is an scholastic field, is precisely a location of schole, no? Scholastic, no? Location of schole, a location of leisure, which is not experienced by people on the ground. And if theology, theological science for that matter, has to render a valid voice for people's lives, or a valid voice for God in the context of people's lives, I think it has to listen to the ground. Of course, we could not say, okay, all theologians, let's all close down our schools and universities and go to the ground, and it's where theology happens. But I think this to and fro movement between academe and the ground makes theologians reflexive and place their sights into questions by people on the ground. That is why, for me, theologians should not be armchair theologians. They should be on the ground. In my context, we have, like all of you, we have read a lot of books, but the books only come to reality when people from the ground asks the most most questions with sense and urgency. So that, for me, is the notion of theological reflexivity, which I think should be available to us all who are doing theology. Thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'm just thinking as you speak, and as I see who's on the conversation, I wish all of you knew each other, because they are just wonderful people. Some people I've heard of, and I see them for the first time now here. I'm just thinking of a book that is going to come out soon by Emmanuel Katangole. His latest book, it will be called Who Do I Belong To? And I think many of the questions raised here raise that question for me as well. Who do we belong to? And if we want to engage in theology that's also resisting, we need to know who our friends are, and we need to nurture new kinds of communities that can live the alternative, as Dion reminded us. So thank you for being part of our world for a moment today, Danny, and for inviting us into yours. And thank you to Luke for moderating, Selina, Tsakani, Dion. Jerry, are you still with us? If you want to perhaps just wrap up. Please, thank you. If you can have the last word.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to say 3 words very quickly with regards to the presentations today that actually appeal to me. The first one is to rethink the pre-centered church. I really thought that was very powerful, Danny. Because I think that actually speaks quite clearly about theology and the need to rethink about theology and to rethink about the church and what the church is all about in terms of how we look at it as an institution, but more now the need to be building on relationships. The second word that I actually picked up was the word of disruption, and I thought disruption is appropriate. How do we disrupt existing structures? How do we disrupt current theological education? How do we disrupt our theological thinking and engagement? And I think disruption is a very important word, especially during this COVID-19 experience. And the third word is location. Jeanette spoke about the church being ideally located to do its work, and I couldn't agree any more with that. But sometimes I wonder, even though the church is ideally located, how often is the church dislocated from reality? And sometimes I think we need to talk about that more deeply. If the only thing that we've learned from COVID-19 is to do live streaming and liturgy and worship and preaching, then we've also missed the boat. Because as you said earlier, it's an opportunity for the church to show compassion, to exercise solidarity, and to take the risk of being with people who are suffering. And if we're missing that opportunity, then who exactly are we, and what are we about as Christians in this world? So thank you so much for very stimulating conversations today. I want to say a very special thank you to Lance and to Stefan, particularly. Stefan, for the idea of working with this when he first discussed it with me. I thought these webinars have been absolutely fantastic. The conversations have been great and stimulating, but I do know that conversations cannot remain as conversations. They must turn into conversions. And conversions, I mean the reality of transformation, the reality of making a difference and creating a new world, which speaks about the fullness of life for all people and all creation. So Stefan, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who participated today and even in the webinars before. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I suppose it's just to greet you, because it's often odd, you don't know when to leave. So I think it's time to leave. Those who want to grab lunch, and then Danny, you will probably get supper. God bless you over this weekend as well, and thank you for all. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, Jerry, and everybody. Selena, good night. Good noon for
Thank
you.
you, Danny. Take care. God bless.
Good afternoon
Bye-bye.
for you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.